Hello and welcome to another episode of World War II TV. I'm Paul Woodadge, and this is continuing our short little examination of the role of actors in World War II. We had our Sam Fuller special about the American film director, and then we had Kenneth More, the beloved British actor, and now we're going to be talking about Dirk Bogarde. And to join me to talk about him is his official biographer, John Coldstream. Welcome to the show, John.
Hello, Paul, and I'm absolutely sure that your viewers are going to want to know that your mum has, after 52 years, finally forgiven you for having prevented her from seeing the final episode of the Forsyte saga.
Yeah, no, I think she has now. It's still a bit of an issue, but she has caught up now, and she's seen the recent version with Damian Lewis. So it's interesting that I did record the Kenneth More episode last night before recording this one, because of the same era, Bogarde and Moore, but perhaps very different in the way they went about their careers. Very, very different personalities. One very open, very bubbly, and one very, very private. And as I was reading your book, and by the way, John's book is an excellent read. Lots of the word paradox kept coming to my mind about Dirk Bogarde. This sense of everything being a bit of a contradiction. You know, at one point, wanting to register as a conscientious objector, then ending up becoming an officer. There's these sort of paradox moments throughout his career that I'm really fascinated by, and I think his fan base today is fascinated by that paradox. So tell me, John, how did you become his official biographer?
It's not a very complicated story, but neither is it an incredibly short one. The position is that I met him first when there was no other connection, when I went to a screening, an interview rather, that he did at the National Film Theatre in 1970, and was introduced to him briefly by his PR man, a wonderful guy called Theo Cowan, very eccentric and enormous fun. Used to turn up at the Cannes Film Festival dressed as if he was going on safari. That was Theo Cowan. And he introduced Dirk to me because I was at that point working on the Telegraph Diary, the Peterborough column. And then it was just hello and a handshake. And what none of us knew at the time, of course, was that Dirk's other half, Tony Forward, was extraordinarily ill in hospital just a mile or so away. But you'd never have guessed it from Dirk's demeanor. So that was the first time I met him. And then the years passed to the mid-1980s, about 15, 16, 17 years later, when my boss at the Telegraph, and by this time I'd moved on to the books pages, recruited Dirk as a reviewer. A wonderful set of circumstances behind that, which I won't go into now, but it was a very, very happy acquisition for us. And Dirk started with a review of a book by Russell Harty, and we knew that when this piece came in from him, it was gold. And from that time on, he became one of our regular reviewers for about 6 or 7 years, in the middle of which Nicholas Shakespeare went off to write a biography of Bruce Chatwin, another enigmatic figure. And left me as a literary editor, which was a huge privilege. But of course, in the glittering baton of star reviewers that he bequeathed to me, Dirk was the shining one, and the one who had the biggest constituency, perhaps. So I got to know him as a commissioner of book reviews from him. We had a lot of fun doing this. I managed to see quite a bit of him over the years. He was extremely kind and gracious to my wife, and he introduced us to some of his family. Now, at the time, he wasn't having any truck with any kind of official biography, but he tolerated a sort of extended essay and picture book, which Sheridan Morley did, and he had already given his blessing to a couple of books about his films, but there was no question of an authorized biography while he was still alive. So when he died in 1999, the question came up, what is going to happen about an official biography? And there were various contenders, I understand, but I think because of the special relationship which had been established between him, me, and his family, I got the job, and it was a wonderful job to have. 4 years of extraordinary exposure to really fascinating people, many of whom knew extraordinarily little about Dirk. And indeed, that was the case with some of his family. They were curious as well to know what really made this relative of theirs tick. So that was the 4 years. The book came out in 2004, and following the publication of the book, I then spent another 3 or 4 years putting together a collection of his letters, Dirk's letters. Dirk was a wonderful correspondent, but they reveal more about him than his autobiographies do. And perhaps it's worth saying at this point, if we don't talk about it later, that Dirk wrote 15 books between 1977 and his death in 1999, of which 7 were autobiographical, and the 2 other books of non-fiction, and several novels, 6 novels, one of which was heavily based upon his wartime experiences. So there we have it. The crucial thing about it all, Paul, is that the connection with his family, with the Bogarde family, with whom I am still enormously friendly, and that is not always the case with official biographers. Many is the tale of appalling happenings when biographers fall out with estates. And I'm privileged to say that that has not happened here. And the people that he introduced me to during the relatively short time that I knew him remain friends today. And in fact, I'm seeing his brother in just a few days' time. So wow. There we have it.
I mean, the words Renaissance man come to my mind as well with regards to Dirk Bogarde. You know, the novelist, poetry, sketching, you name it, he did it all. I mean, I'm reminded of my Spike Milligan show I did back last November. Very different people, Spike Milligan and Dirk Bogarde, but both were very good at very different aspects within the arts, so to speak. But, you know, as you read your book, there's obviously gaps because he destroyed some of his own letters. There's elements of his diary just got lost. And so did you ever feel you got a complete picture, or did you only ever get sort of 3/4 of him?
Gosh, I don't think anybody was ever going to get a complete picture of Dirk. You're quite right. Before he left from France in 1986, he destroyed an enormous amount of his personal papers. But he left, when he died, he left behind him a number of tantalizing clues. And I mean, for example, let me just hold this up and I hope you can see this.
Oh, yeah.
That is his officer's record of service.
AB 429, yeah.
He left that, Army Book 439, absolutely. He left enough of these little kind of hints as to veracity for one to be able to piece together a good deal more than he had told in his life stories, his memoirs. It's very difficult in a way to put the ultimate finger on this, but he was a terrific storyteller. He'd always written, ever since he was a very young boy. He'd written. And they say to be a great writer, you must read. In his case, he wrote. And what he did so successfully, Paul, was to write from here. It came straight from the stomach, the chest. You felt that you were listening to someone who had about him the smack of truth. Well, if you then overlay that with the capacity to tell stories, you've got the kernel of truth and the exterior, which is the flamboyance, the wit, all of that. There's something very important that I might need to say now, and this is about the letters that he wrote. There was a time in the 1970s when he first moved to France, 1970 itself, 1970 and 71, around about the time of the making of Death in Venice with Luchino Visconti, when he was in his rather lovely farmhouse, nothing grand, just beautiful setting and so on, when telephone was an expensive and rather primitive instrument. So he would sit at his typewriter and he would bash out these letters on A4 paper. very closely typed, hardly any margin. So an enormous number of words to a page. And then he'd turn the page and there'd be an enormous number of words on the other page. And they were like one side of a conversation. And they're so precious for that because, as I said before, they seem to come from a place from where there'd not been an enormous amount of thought. He was just whacking out whatever was coming to his mind at the time. And that's what makes the letters so great and so vivid, sometimes a little bit on the edge, like his acting. but so, one has this picture of a man who loved to tell stories, and he started doing that when he was a child. And he edited a newspaper at school. He edited the Forces newspaper in Java. We might be speaking about that in a minute. He then, when he really got going with the writing, having finished with the contractual side of the movies, when he finished his second stint at Rank, and they began to write letters in a more a keener way. And then, of course, in the 70s, as I said, it all came to fruition with this wonderful explosion of magnificent letter writing.
So it's a combination of the letter writing, his own autobiographies and his novels, and what other people said about him. And then from that, you managed to build the picture. Because I haven't read his own books for a long time, but to me, they're in that same category as the David Niven books, where brilliant to read, but a lot of it is exaggerated and it's the storytelling, but they're great, but they're not truthful in complete sense. That modern autobiographies are very much that, revealing all their demons. That's the modern style, isn't it? Yeah. But back when Dirk and Alec Guinness and David Niven were writing, it was very much almost part of their public act. The book was a pretend version of themselves. It was a staged version of themselves for public consumption, but not really anything particularly deep and revealing. But an incredible career. We should go back to the beginning and how he ended up becoming involved in acting, really.
That was something he'd been doing again from a child, toy theatre stuff with Sister and so on. But he went into an amateur dramatic society in Newark in East Sussex, called the NADS, the Newark Amateur Dramatic Society, and performed in a couple of plays there. And this is pre-war, obviously. And then went off to Amersham to appear in Rep. That was, of course, the basic training. There's the catterick of the theatre world. Go off and do Rep in those days. And then managed to get some work at Kew Theatre by the Thames at Kew in London. And indeed made 2 West End appearances by 1939. In fact, they were both in 1939. The second of which was at Wyndham's Theatre, a review called Diversion Number 2. And at that point, war was definitely happening. And so Dirk knew that, but this time, of course, he was 18. So he knew that, he would either enlist or be called up or whatever was going to happen. And indeed, by 41, he did enlist. What I'm saying is that he had a very heavy grounding in amateur and semi-professional and indeed professional theatre, although to a lesser extent in the professional theatre, at the time that he went off to war and had to abandon it. But he didn't abandon it completely, of course, because he did some acting while he was in the forces.
But you very kindly sent some illustrations and photos to use today in this show, and we'll start bringing them up on screen now. And this is one of the early ones. I mean, he was sketching, he was writing poetry very early on when war clouds were gathering. He's starting to put some feelings down on paper in both sketch and word form. And as a young man with war looming, do we know much about what he thought about that in terms of politics, in a sense? Was he a patriot? Because, we are talking about Dirk, but of course he isn't Dirk then. He's still Derek, isn't he? And he is Derek. He's from an immigrant family. So his feeling as European British, do we know what he was thinking about the war clouds gathering?
His grandfather, of course, was Belgian, and he was the immigrant. His father, Ulrich, was born here. Very important person in the equation, particularly now that we're talking about military matters, because Ulrich was in the First World War himself. He was in the Royal Regiment of Artillery and then joined 22 Brigade. So was in France and Flanders and then in Italy. 15, 17, 1918 in Italy, and was finally demobbed in February 1919. So Ulrich van den Bogarde, Dirk's dad, he'd seen the war at very first hand. And of course, what is common with almost everybody you talk to and about these two conflicts is that the people who took part in them hardly ever spoke about them, particularly not the First World War. And that was very much the case with Ulrich. Ulrich, a fascinating man, he had clearly seen some terrible, terrible things, and they affected him greatly. And of course, that was passed down through to Ulrich's three children. The effect of war was perfectly patent. However, he was able to push it to the back of his mind by acquiring and then making a huge success of a really important job as the art editor of the Times. Not the arts editor, but the art editor. In other words, he was responsible for all the pictorial material in the Times. Huge, huge responsibility and a great office to have. And he did that for many years. The war was not something that was discussed in the household. Ulrich's wife was a former actress, Margaret, whose mind was on other things than warfare. Very colourful character she was, by all accounts. And that's where some of the flamboyant side of Dirk would come from, some of the more extrovert genes. And the introvert would come from Dad. And so you ask about his politics. Well, Dirk was apolitical in those days. There was a sense of right and wrong, and he would certainly have been aware that the Second World War was going to be fought for a very just cause. The picture you flashed up a moment ago was from his pretty early childhood, and the extraordinary thing about it is, I mean, this predates the Blitz by several years. There was no bombing of London at the time that he drew this. He was in his, this was in the early 30s. And so he is imagining what looks very much like St. Paul's with London buses and with searchlights going everywhere. Extraordinary prophetic piece by him, and which then his artistic bent took him to the Chelsea School of Art. Was part of the progress that I haven't discussed with you so far. Chelsea School of Art, which is where he was taught by some very distinguished people, including Graham Sutherland's wife, who was an expert in fashion design. So the sketchbook from which one or two of the other pictures that I've sent you came, that has in it a number of pictures which are very heavily influenced by what Dirk was learning at Kathleen Sutherland's hands. And they're very, very talented. He could easily have made a career as a commercial artist. And maybe more than that. You mentioned his Renaissance man characteristics, and this was definitely one of them. He could have been hugely successful at it. Now, rather joyfully, of course, we all benefit from his artistic skills because he illustrated one or two of his own volumes of autobiography with his pictures, most notably the first book, The Postilion Struck by Lightning. So here are the signs, the early signs of his capacity with pen and ink, or in that case, pencil.
But I'm just thinking, though, his father's experience in the First World War as still with a Belgian name, his father, so Dirk's grandfather being Belgian, would have noticed more in the First World War civilian casualties, would have noticed more the impact on the locals. A lot of Tommies who went over to the First World War, all they ever really kind of noticed was what was happening to their own units. But as a Belgian, he's fighting in his father's backyard. So I'm sure that, although you said Ulrich didn't talk about to Dirk, some of that impact on what is happening in Europe and how civilians get caught up in things would have filtered through somehow. And when we get to the sketches later on in the Falaise Gap and the fact he's doing pictures of churches, I think he was very aware, it seems to me, of the civilian experience as well as the military experience. And maybe that's sort of his Europeanness coming through there somehow subliminally.
It's hugely important in his life, his Europeanness. In fact, I always felt that one of the great bonds between him and Joseph Losey, who was born in America, but who had this very, very powerful sense of Europe running through his veins. That was part of the connection between them. And they're both outsiders. Being an outsider is a very important aspect of Dirk's life. You're entirely right. He did have a huge sympathy for the collateral damage, the personal collateral damage, which was caused by war, the completely unnecessary suffering of people who should never have been caught up with anything like this at all. And yes, when he was going up through France, Belgium, and into Holland, with the forces after D-Day, he was, yes, definitely very, very conscious of what had been happening on the ground to the people who should not, under any normal circumstances, have been affected.
I mean, this came up in the show I did about Sam Fuller a couple of days ago. Someone who's a journalist, someone who's an artistic person. They're looking at the world in a different way to other people, especially in war when people are there to simply survive. They're there. It's a matter of just staying alive and doing one's job before the next horrific event happens. But people like Dirk, people like Sam Fuller, who have this way of looking at the world through artistic eyes, they see things other people don't see. And I've interviewed hundreds of World War II veterans. I've looked at hundreds of World War II memoirs, and these images you sent me that we'll go through later on, they reveal that he is really observing what's happening around him. It's not just another town in a list of towns they're going through. It's each town he passes through is another tragedy that's unfolded, another set of civilians who've been caught up in this, and you can feel that each step of that way burning into his psyche and it damaging him. I mean, everyone's damaged by war. But I would make the point that someone artistic is possibly damaged by it more because you see such beauty around you destroyed. You see such devastation. You see animal life dead. I mean, as I drove out, we'll get to a photo. I drove past the airfield he was stationed, and all the veterans in Normandy talk about the bloated cattle in the fields. And he would have seen things like that. He would have seen that, blood running through streams and things like that, a leftover of war that some people just didn't notice because their brains were switched off to noticing that. The only way they could function was just by, putting one foot in front of the other and carrying on marching along, metaphorically speaking. But Dirk is there and he's seeing stuff. But we'll move on. So interesting that we've got a photo of him in uniform, but this is Journey's End. This is 1939, one of those plays that still keeps coming back. There's a film version of it recently, a couple of years ago. And it's interesting that one of his last jobs before joining the army proper was in an anti-war play, I suppose you'd call Journey's End. And I didn't know that they were even showing Journey's End in 1939. It's an odd play to put on stage with what's happening in the world. But tell us about how he got the role in Journey's End.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. It is a very odd thing to be doing at a time when you'd have thought that eyes would be off the negative side and that would be all heading towards the positive. But no, this was done not at Uckfield, at Newark in East Sussex, which is an amateur dramatic society. And Dirk, he was very friendly with the people who ran that little theatre. A sort of girlfriend, Nerine Cox. It was her dad who did this, who put this show together and put the theatre together. So he got the part of Raleigh, who is a man, of course, a very young man, straight out of school, who, as a young second lieutenant, loses his innocence. And how true is that of so many very, very young men who went off to the First World War and indeed to the Second, but particularly the First. And he then took the part again, a very similar looking set. And this was from his Octu days. There are no spectacular reviews or anything from it, but it was clearly a part which meant a lot to him. And even if he had not discussed a great deal about military matters with his father, enough had seeped into him for him to understand the appalling costs that were likely to be levied on those who undertook to go or were made to go. And in Dirk's case, of course, he undertook to go rather than was made to go. But I think, and we might come to this in a moment, but they always say that many sons do their absolute utmost to try to impress their fathers. And I think Dirk's signing up, Dirk's enlisting, definitely had something to do with that.
We'll plough on through the various images you provided, and we'll keep on telling these anecdotes as we go. And there's some real depth of thought behind his paintings and his sketching at this time. Maybe things he's picked up from his father and from reading and learning the lines of Journey's End, I guess, which is pretty bleak. So a lot of things are filtering into his 18, 19-year-old brain at this point about warfare and what warfare does. And it's coming through in these images so clearly. Absolutely right.
And the devastation is all too clear, and the very vivid colouring. Again, the artistic skill coupled with a kind of documentary feel. Even though he'd not been there, you're absolutely right. He enough had impinged itself on his imagination for him to be able to render this kind of thing in a very, very powerful way. Now there we are. That's 1918, Satyr's Wood. Yeah, I'm not familiar with Satyr's Wood. You probably are, Paul.
It's not a well-known one. No, I mean I'm not a First World War guy particularly, but it's obviously a story that has filtered down. I mean, all those First World War battles have horrific moments. They all end with this similar kind of imagery, and but again, that's it's very graphic. It's not poppies in a field, that is it? It's right. It's very somber, very dark. And I think people who are watching this will be really amazed by some of these images. And, we think of actors as being a bit kind of light and fluffy and not very serious sometimes. And I think that, Kenneth More, perhaps yesterday, was maybe very jovial and enjoyed life. But Dirk, clearly very early on, is showing signs of being tormented in some ways by lots of things going on.
I think that is...
This one, I think, was the favourite you sent me. Just incredible. What can you say?
Exactly. It's all there. It is an expression of some kind of cataclysm, and with a heck of a lot of casualty going on. It's vivid is the word again, and it explodes off the page at you. It's very powerful.
I mean, you could clearly see him having a career as an artist or a writer or a poet or set decoration, because he was doing that as well. Any one of those careers could have been what he did for the rest of his life. I mean, clearly multi-skilled, multi-talented. And that one there, I mean, the colours in that, I love art, and that's great.
Yes, that one and the one after it are heavily influenced by Henry Moore. Who was, of course, working in the underground, producing really, really powerful work. But in black and white, his tendency was to sketch. This is colour sketching, which can be disastrous if it doesn't work. But these really work. You can see there is a drama happening here. Here, what are these people doing underground? They are trying to keep themselves safe. And the strange sepulchral lighting and the very familiar the branding of the London Underground symbol on the right-hand side. And the other picture I think shows Piccadilly Circus more clearly. There we go. And it's it is very, very expressive. There aren't many of these pictures. They're all in a sketchbook. And this is him practicing what he has been learning at Chelsea School of Art, where Henry Moore was one of the teachers, of course. And so it's all coming out, and he needs, just like his writing, he needs to let it out. And whatever it is, whatever he's thinking, whatever he's feeling, it must find expression somewhere. That's what made him such a fine actor, as well as such a fine writer.
But by 1941, he finds himself in the army, and in his looks like it's been issued about a day before 1937 pattern battle dress there and field service cap, and began this career that he didn't necessarily want, but he was both good at and bad at the same time. It's interesting in his career, officers are saying he's good and he's not. The paradox is the word that comes through again when I was reading about his career, because he didn't take to the military life well, but in a way he did. So tell us a bit about how he adapted to military life, because it's very different from coming from the theatre and doing what he'd been doing, and art school to military life is a big transition. So how did he adapt, and what can you draw from how he wrote about these experiences?
I think that the one thing that comes through loud and clear with him is that he did actually, despite being an outsider, love to be part of a highly professional team. And he did respond well to discipline. It's really, really interesting. You'd think that there's a lot of colour in his character, and you'd have thought that would have been to his detriment in something like the army. Well, I think to some senior officers it possibly was, but to others it actually worked well for him, because he established a personality, and that's a very important thing. You don't want to dominate, but you want to encourage by enthusiasm. And I think he would have been very enthusiastic at the jobs that he was given to do, particularly later on. I think the early days, the training and so on, he found pretty grim, but he came through it all fine.
Yeah, and yet your book says he was one of the best in his platoon with the Lee Enfield rifle. He was very good at marching and the foot drill. Yeah, and I would never have guessed that. Before reading your book, I would have imagined he'd have thrived at the academic side of things and map reading perhaps and understanding terrain. But to find he was also good at foot drill, it was odd that was something he was also good at. Obviously, he's just very good at what he does. He's very, very skillful. But
well, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. Anything that he applied himself to was done to the best of his ability, and it paid off so often. Yes, there were one or two people in a senior role who didn't take to him entirely, but now you just flashed up here. This is so interesting. He is 20 years old. He's just been in the army for 3 months. So he was at Catterick, and at this point, I think where'd he gone to? No, I think he was still very much training, and he writes this poem, which is about a sniper. And interesting, it's 80 years old this year. There's a lot of anniversaries this year. Paul, it's his centenary. We haven't actually mentioned that, but it was his centenary 10 days ago. It would have been his 100th birthday. So he wrote this when he was 20 as a very sophisticated poem about a sniper. And whether it came about through his father's work at the Times or not, I've no idea. But this poem was published in the Times Literary Supplement, under the name of Dirk Bogarde, which is, quite something at the age of 20 to have your first published poem in that august organ. And it's so fascinating because, of course, it's about someone operating in a very secret way. There's camouflage here. We're going to come to camouflage in a minute, I'm sure. There is someone who is elusive. There is someone who is weighing up the options. It's a very fine piece of work. I'm delighted that the TLS itself has popped it up on its own website this week and made mention of it 2 weeks ago. So there's again, you talked of the polymath. This is him. So on the one hand, you've got him being very proficient at drill, very proficient at all the basic stuff that you need to do as a trainee soldier. You've also got him helping his fellow trainees to write their letters home, because there are a lot of extremely illiterate people around him, lovely people, illiterate people. And he made himself very popular by doing that. He's really embracing something which, as you said earlier, he didn't necessarily want to do, but he was doing it, so he was going to give it his absolutely best shot. And here we are. He's 3 months into his military career, and he turns out a piece of work like this, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, and again, it's prophetic. It's talking about things he hasn't experienced yet. I mean, he's been training, but he's not been under fire by a sniper. He's not been doing that. You know, again, I'm comparing him a bit to Spike Milligan, and at this point, Spike Milligan's going through his training. He found the foot drill terrible. He was useless at it. He couldn't march very well, and he was doing cartoons and sketches and poetry, but only about what he'd actually experienced at the time. So when he's in training, the poetry's about training and about the loose fit of uniforms. Dirk he's 2 years ahead. That's the weird thing is he's talking about combat, and he's drawing pictures of combat before he's seen any. There's something very visionary about him, although that's maybe a label that's putting maybe too much onto it. But it's remarkable where his brain is at this point.
Well, it comes back to that initial pencil drawing of what looked like a blitz. It is a forward-looking vision. You're absolutely right.
And then, of course, his skills get kind of recognized, and he wants to progress as well. You know, he's thriving in this environment that perhaps isn't natural to him, and he goes for officer training, and again, is very good at it. Went through Sandhurst and commissioned there, and he got to pick the regiment of his choice to go into. And did he see that as a progression upwards, or was it a progression of his? Was it because he wanted to challenge himself, or was it because he thought it would be doing a better role for the country, so to speak?
Oh, natural progression, and I think he was in his way, he was enjoying it, Paul. You know, there's something that he says much later on, which we'll probably come back to, that, you know, he was in fact quite at home, but slightly on the edge. You know, he was never going to allow himself to be totally understood by anybody, or totally in thrall to anybody, or obligated to anybody. But, you know, given those small strictures, maybe quite big strictures, given that he was going to do the absolute best. He'd carry on. He'd want to be the best that he could under whatever circumstances were being chucked at him. So yes, and here we are. He's, you know, again proving himself to his dad. You know, he's very, very smart uniform. He's looking pretty proud. There's nothing knowing or sly or, you know, offbeat. This is a very natural commissioning day picture.
And it's worth pointing out that in 1941, 42, 43, the British Army is something very different to what it had been 10 years earlier, when it was traditionally in that post-war era. I'm thinking of Alan Allport's brilliant book, Browned Off, about, you know, the British Army in that era, of it being the sort of second brother joins the army as an officer, and the first brother joins the priesthood, the third, but that kind of thing. By 41, 42, it is a civilian army mostly. Everyone's coming from somewhere now. So you do, even things like the commandos and the long-range desert group, a lot of the officers who formed that, they're not former British Army people. They're artists and adventurers and college graduates who've found themselves in the army and have found a way of flourishing there by changing things a bit, by not looking at warfare the same old way. So I guess Dirk had people around him who weren't stiff and military, that made it was an environment that someone like him could flourish, that perhaps if he'd been in the army in 1937, for example, it would have been a very different army back then.
I think that's absolutely right. And thank God for it in all sorts of ways. Yeah. Yeah,
and it was that army that won the war for us, let's be honest. It was the civilian army that ran up the beaches on Normandy on June the 6th, the civilian army that pushed its way up through Italy. The professional army, the small army, had the problems earlier in the war in Dunkirk and Singapore and what have you. And it was this input of new thinking that was so critical to the British Army ending up being able to overcome the Third Reich and the Japanese, because it came in with new ideas. And I guess Dirk was able to do that, and his skills, you know, he talks about you talked about camouflage. He recognized that he had some skill sets that could be used going forward in terms of his artistic ability and his writing ability as well. So we'll move on through, and then there's this another poem, 43 this time.
Yes, here he is, sitting in railway stations, steel cathedrals, published in the Poetry Review, and it's just a picture of the kind of the slightly melancholy sitting around waiting for the next piece of travel to be carted off to, you know, wherever, because at this point he was moving around a lot. He was doing infantry training, and he was doing a street fighting course at one point. He went up to Inverary to train for Operation Lifebelt, which was intended to take back the Azores. There are all sorts of complicated stuff around that, which we don't have time to go into. But he was on the move a lot during this period. And this poem was published in September 43, shortly before he was promoted to lieutenant. And shortly before the really interesting stuff begins for Dirk, which is when he goes into intelligence, which he studies at Matlock. And then he goes to Medmenham, the famous centre where particularly aerial reconnaissance photography was being pioneered. So you've got him by now looking very smart indeed, and there's his dad recording him for posterity for very elegant pictures. And those are around about the same time, 43, 44. And then I think, Paul, your next slide is...
Oh, this is ID card.
Yeah, this is...
And just to jump in, it is interesting, again, in your book, this, and you just mentioned it yourself, he's going through multiple courses, being moved around a lot. It's like the brigadier that you write about, they don't quite know what to do with Dirk's talent. They don't quite know. He never got a command in that sense. He never got, here you are, here's your company, here's your platoon. It was always in these liaison, advisory, and intelligence before it was actually officially assigned to intelligence. They were relying on his intelligence more than his perhaps leadership. This course after course after course. So he builds up an incredible array of skills that by the time we get to the pivotal summer of 1944, when invasion is looming, as you say, he ends up in intelligence. And that air and intelligence is something we've talked about in World War II TV quite a lot, because it was one of the things we excelled at. The Constance Brown, the WAF officer who invented the stereoscopic glasses that we could use to look at photos, and the Allied ability to take photos of all the places we're invading and study them and study them and study them was a huge arm to our arsenal in winning that war. And it's something that once Dirk got into it, he that was where he really thrived and excelled, didn't it? I mean, he found a natural for that.
The business of aerial reconnaissance photography, the Mata Hari of this war, as it was described. Yeah. And it absolutely suited Dirk down to the ground. When he was first being asked what field he would like to specialize in, he said camouflage. And he wasn't, as it turned out, he wasn't given the job of camouflage, but more interestingly, perhaps, he was given the job of penetrating camouflage. So other people's camouflage, he became an expert at scything through in a very minute and precise way. Yes, it is just so fascinating. It's one of the great. It's one of the, not a mystery so much as a genuine fascination, that here was a man who, because of the cards that nature had dealt him, had created a kind of shell, a carapace around himself from a very young age. And then he finds himself at the time of war having a job which is all about it is all about camouflage, and it is all about its how it can be used and how it can be seen through. So yes,
and lateral thinking and thinking outside of the box and looking at life in a different way. And the army for all its skills, does tend to produce people very similar to each other, because that's how you win wars. You have a platoon of men who can follow orders and do the same thing at the same time to move across the field and knock out the enemy. And Dirk that's not Dirk at all. Dirk is very different to that, and he found this role. And we'll talk about, because Normandy, he's not in Normandy immediately after the invasion. It takes a couple of weeks, and then the Allies build 27 air landing grounds within 7 days of the invasion. The whole army was to bring the 2nd Tactical Air Force into Normandy and then be able to engage what's left of the German Luftwaffe, and most importantly, prevent all the German reinforcements moving up towards the beachhead. And he finds himself at Sommerview Airfield, ALG 8, just outside of Bayeux. So he was stationed about 5 or 6. In fact, I can still get to his accommodation within my 10-kilometer perimeter that I now have enforced in France, part of the lockdown. So I can get to where Dirk was posted, and this is a sketch of his time in Normandy, and his role there was an army officer attached to a Royal Air Force airfield in terms of identifying and looking at aerial intelligence, and a very specialized role, and also quite lonely because you're not part of the RAF. You're an outsider. That word outsider coming in again. You're not one of the pilots. You're not one of the air crew. So you don't socialize with them in that way because they're very cliquey. I guess in a weird way, he kind of thrived being the outsider, or at least not thrived. It was a role he was very used to.
There's absolutely no doubt about that at all, Paul. The draft of one, he calls himself at various stages in his writings. Yes, here he is in Normandy. That tent there is sharing with Captain Kenneth Costin. And there is, in a moment, I think, a photograph of 4 officers together.
Well, there's the Airfield Monument. I took that last week, so I just happened to go past there.
Right. Okay.
And,
okay, and there was a very
and there is the airfield. I mean, just to do, because you write in the book about the farmland was just taken over, and it was incredibly quick process because they used the steel mesh to make the runways and the steel panels to make the hard standings, so they could knock up an airfield in about 48 hours, and that was the arm we had. And you can still see when you drive around Normandy where these airfields were, because the hedgerows haven't grown back through where the runways were. So you find these larger swathes of greenery. You think, well, that must have been an airfield around there. And most of the ALGs, if not all of them, have a little marker now. And so people who come and research their family members can find these little bits of evidence about where these airfields were. And it was an incredibly important part of our arm. And the intelligence was incredibly important aspect of this arm. So tell us more about what he was doing at this point.
Yes, well, during this period, and there's a little story about how effective he could be and just what this job was about, working out of a sort of mobile unit, a mobile caravan. That, by the way, that picture there is a view from his tent. And this drawing is in the British Museum. That's how highly it was regarded. More about how they all came to be put on show later on. But yes, this is the view from the tent. While he was working in the very primitive sort of hut where they could do the job, there was a moment when, and I should say he was working here with the Royal Canadian Air Force rather than the RAF itself. So again, the distance which you were talking about just now, Paul, that outsiderishness was even more acute. There was a General Roma, as he became, Richard Roma, who was one of the pilots in the Royal Canadian Air Force 39 Reconnaissance Wing, who flew over what he thought from a sighting with the naked eye was some tanks and panzers. And he broke radio silence to report this, and by doing so, committed quite a serious offence. So he had to justify that it was worthwhile doing so. So he rushes into the little hut where Dirk was doing his work and asks Dirk to identify from the photographs that he took from his aeroplane what was going on the ground. And Dirk was able, using his stereoscope, to say, yes, these were indeed panzers. And so, of course, that information was enough to let Richard Romer off the hook big time, and because it was an extraordinarily important sighting. But there we are. We have something which is just briefly spotted with the naked eye, might or might not have been something offensive, and it turned out to be extraordinarily dangerous. And that is the best example throughout the whole of the reading that I was able to do on this of exactly how Dirk's work could be so important and how the whole of that operation was so important.
And just an aside to that, Richard Romer, the general, I've got his autobiography, Patton's Gap.
Yeah.
He doesn't like Brits at all. I mean, he particularly doesn't like Montgomery. If ever you read his book, it basically goes, page 1, Montgomery's a dick. Page 2, Montgomery's a dick. Page 273, Montgomery's a dick. And not in those words, but that's basically what it says. Yeah. He has no time for British command. He doesn't like British officers, doesn't like the British way of things, doesn't like the way we run. He prefers the Canadians, he prefers the North Americans. And the fact he praises Dirk Bogarde is really, when I read that, I was like, wow, Richard Romer saying something nice about a limey. There's a turn up for the books. I didn't mention earlier, another bit of prophetic thing is that when he was still in England, Dirk, using the aerial reconnaissance, was one of the guys who identified that 21st Panzer had moved closer to the D-Day beaches than they previously been thought, which is interesting because it predicts the bridge too far, him playing General Browning, who, of course, is being influenced by a junior officer coming in saying, there are these tanks in photos. So there's a strange foreshadowing of future things in the experiences that he goes through, which is, you couldn't make it up. If you put that in a novel, it would go, you've made that up. 30 years later, he plays a guy who's affected. It wouldn't make sense. But yeah, the Richard Romer story is important, and that use of aerial intelligence is very vital. But it seems to me the change in Dirk's Normandy or ETO experience is when he starts seeing the tragic side of things, because some of you would have been a bit separated from the gruesome reality of World War II. It was not near the front line particularly. It was a nice little peaceful village. But as the breakout begins, the squadrons move a little bit, and he starts getting closer to the actual sharp edge of the fighting and the Falaise Gap. And I'm going to go off on a tangent about General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was a very pragmatic, very organized, unemotional commander, and that's exactly what we needed in terms of what he did in the ETO. There were 2 times Eisenhower, I call it, loses it and becomes very affected by things, and it's Dachau at the end of the war, taking German civilians through Dachau, and it's the Falaise Gap. He writes about walking through the Falaise Gap, and you could walk for hundreds of meters without stepping on anything except human decaying flesh. He talks about Eisenhower. And interesting, and we'll touch on Belsen later on, is that Dirk Bogarde, the 2 moments in World War II that I think most affect him are the Falaise Gap and concentration camps. So there's a connection with Eisenhower there, because they are 2 areas of just absolute wanton destruction. And every Allied officer who walked through the Falaise Gap, even if you're seeing the dead SS, these are the worst enemy you have engaged. These are people who have murdered helpless prisoners, and yet when you walk through the Falaise Gap and you see these columns after columns of wagons and tanks destroyed, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to feel some sort of empathy for how these people lost their lives, even if they're not very nice people. So tell us about what you feel Dirk began to experience. He sees the nastier side of warfare. Did it close him off? Did he want to write about it more? I mean, we've got some sketches, but that experience of seeing the Falaise Gap was obviously very traumatic. Tell us about it.
Yes, but he didn't write home about it. Again, of course, so much of what they were able to put down on paper, was very limited because what it could give away. So he didn't write home about it. What I think he did, it was a bit like Don McCullin and his photography. It was to use his skills as an artist to detach himself and produce these really very expert watercolor drawings, which and here we have, now this is a pencil sketch, but there are a number of watercolor drawings which, along with pencil sketches, found their way into a very fine exhibition at the end of the war. There he is doing his job in his truck. I think we're still in France here.
Yeah.
And the Arromanche, yes, that's the watercolor drawing. And I think, as I'm saying, it's this detachment which the photographer or the artist can give themselves, so that they don't become too immersed in the horror.
Just to jump in about these two particular sketches here of Arromanche and Arnhem, is that Arromanche and Arnhem in July of 1944 were about the busiest places in Europe. Arromanche was the functioning Mulberry Harbour, so it was just trucks, convoys. Arnhem, which is the next village over, is also incredibly busy because this is transit camps and fuel depots and vehicle parks. And yet somehow he's managing to capture them. That to me looks like Norfolk. That photo that reminds of somewhere up, I don't know, near Cromer or something. How he's managing to see that?
Well, it's what's left behind, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than the present day activity. And I think that comes back to what you were saying a moment ago about the destruction. It's what is left behind. And that takes a lot longer to do anything about. If you've got trucks and so on moving around, they're going to disappear. This is there to stay, and possibly for a very long time. And there we are. There's a good example of what was that? He and Chris Greaves, who was a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force, would go off together. They were companions on these adventures. Greaves was a very good artist as well, and they'd go off in a jeep and they would sketch in a certain amount of peacefulness, which they were able to find. And there we are. Another example. There's no sign of any person there, no people around, there's no activity around. It's just a wreckage. It's a wrecked place of worship in that case. And here's a grocery which has been ruined. Very fine picture, that one, by the way. It
is, yeah. And he captures Tillie Sorselle. I mean, Tillie was almost raised off the map. It was just terrible destruction. I mean, you go there now, it's all 1950s, 1960s construction. Nice little village there. Lots of things to see around it, but it was almost destroyed. It was a crossroads on a bit of high ground, essentially. So, he is, again, with his role being able to move around, he's kind of freelance in a sense within the military. He's able to see a lot of this destruction that, I've spoken to veterans of infantry units and armor units who aren't getting to see much of Normandy because they're inside a tank or they're following the pair of boots in front of them. His ability, his role in traveling around and actually being able to take time to look and see beyond the surface, because when you're a military figure in Normandy, you're following MPs and signs up saying 5 miles an hour here and second div HQ 400 meters on the right kind of thing. You're not seeing that truth of reality because everything's behind mine tape and barricades. He's able to go and see, and it's interesting that he's seeing these places after that they've had their worst experiences. So he's seeing the fallout, if you like. He's seeing the civilians still, I'm guessing, struggling to get water and having to draw water, and the well power's not on again yet. They're still in ruins, and that obviously had an effect on what he's seeing. And that one there is particularly haunting. Anyone who's seen one of my Falaise Gap shows, talked about some of the imagery down there. We've shown some graphic images of charred German bodies down there. That's a great painting.
It is,
regardless of the rather somber nature of it. It's a great painting. And again, this is being done. He's probably not got a huge amount of paints and watercolors with him. He's doing things on the fly. He's putting in his sketchbook, but incredibly insightful to what was going on there. There's a real story behind these images that is fascinating.
Absolutely, no question about that.
So we're getting towards the liberation of Europe is onwards and upwards by now. He gets some leave. I mean, we will talk about Market Garden, and of course we must bring up the big important Belsen story that you've done a lot of work investigating or behind that. But at this point now, I think if we compare that photo to the one of him being commissioned 2 years ago, you see he's he's aged. I mean, there's a lot of weight on his face there. He's grown up. He's seen a lot more of the world by this point. Looks tired, frankly, in that photo.
Yes, and not surprisingly. You're absolutely right. What he'd seen had taken its toll, and he looks altogether more serious and more worldly wise. And there comes a moment not so far ahead, although we haven't reached Market Garden quite at that point. But then what happens after Market Garden, of course, changes everything for him.
Yeah.
So yes, he's grown up. You're so right. And there he's doing his stuff.
So let's bring up Market Garden, because a lot of the my prep for these shows, a lot of the little cheap, quick throwaway articles on the internet say that Dirk Bogarde was directly involved in Market Garden. Not quite the truth. He was on the periphery of it. He was in the area, but he wasn't. It's not. I've read accounts saying he was part of General Browning's staff, and that's not the case. He was in the area, wasn't he? But he definitely, he was in Nijmegen in the time just after Market Garden. But again, weird that he was to think he was going to come back and play General Browning all those years later. But by this stage, the war, he's getting close also, Netherlands and Belgium, to his ancestral home as well. The Bogarde backyard, if you like, is much closer. At this point, where's Dirk's mind right now? Is he firmly in the war? Is he wanting to get out of it? Is he looking forward to the end? What's going on at this point?
Well, he's certainly having a lousy time in Holland, as everybody was, but nothing like as bad, of course, as Audrey Hepburn, subject of one of your earlier talks. Fascinating that was. He had a cushy number compared with what so many other people were doing, particularly those who are in the front line. So, he certainly wasn't having a load of fun. But, you read some of the letters that he was sending back to his sister, and at this time he was able to do so with rather more, a little bit more freedom anyway. Quite a lot more freedom. They were, making a lot of entertainment for themselves. There were shows. There were things to do. But no one was progressing very far. Everybody was bogged down, and very dramatically so. It became quite clear after a while that something had to move. And I think there's a postcard which I think you will be bringing up in a second, Paul. Here we go. Right, now this was written to Dirk's sister on the 18th of January 1945, when things were still extraordinarily grim. And he writes to Elizabeth these words: "I thought you would be interested to have a look at this. It's going to be one of the most famous bridges in history. I used to cross there 2 times a day, and they were always shelling it!" ! It was definitely not a very nice ride, but oddly enough, they didn't ever hit me and my Jeep, though they came very near to it more than once! No news at all. Life is very cold and dull at the moment. Well, talk about prophetic as far as the bridge and its place in history is concerned.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these were grim and difficult days, as anybody.
And do you think there's a bit of a weight of burden of the fact he has had, as regards the ETO, he's had a fairly cushy job? I mean, he's working in office, he's his own boss, he's not got a sergeant major shouting at him, and he's not in the same level of danger as the guys who are walking through fields in an infantry regiment with a pig sticker bayonet on a number 4 rifle. So I've had that with other people who at one point of the war, they're kind of glad to be in a lesser role, but as the war progresses, there is this guilt that kind of kicks in of the fact that they're feeling that I'm in this cushy job, but for something else, I might have ended up, being dead in a cemetery down the road. So did he ever feel any kind of inclination to kind of put himself forward for hazardous duty or something, or go and do something different?
I don't think so. I don't think that. He wanted to contribute as best he could. I don't think he would have been much cop in the front line. He and technology, for one thing, were not the greatest of friends. I'm with him there, by the way. I think anything mechanical was no fun for him at all. But as you said earlier on, and quite rightly, he was fairly handy with a rifle under the right conditions. Whether he would have been any good under extreme conditions is anybody's guess. But no, I don't think he was particularly enthusiastic about going any further forward. He was just, wanting to do the best job he possibly could under,
and that shows a sensible head on a sensible shoulders, and you're recognizing that the job you're doing is an important one for the war effort. He's got a skill, he's got skill sets, he's got this intelligence. Better to use it that way and keep on going forward with that. But at the same time as the war's going, with this interesting thing that his art is now being noticed. So he starts. People start knowing. Well, he's already had poems published. He's already had different things happen to him. So his career in terms of the arts is still kind of bubbling away, isn't it, at this point?
Oh, very, very much. And so, again, the circumstances surrounding the hanging of this exhibition are not totally clear, but it was obvious that a record of what had been happening with our forces in Europe was being made in all kinds of ways. And so he and Christopher Greaves jointly held this show at, or were invited to have this show. It was called with the BLA, the British Land Army, in May '45. And so it was after the surrender at Lüneburg Heath, close to which, by the way, 39 Wing of the Royal Canadian Air Force were. So yes, this was on a visit back on leave after VE Day, and this exhibition was very successful indeed. And the pictures, sadly, in a way, have become scarce. They were dispersed in all sorts of places, but one or two people like the Fine Arts Society and indeed the British Museum acquired one or two of the pictures, so they are still, as it were, available for public view. So yes, it was a very happy signal of how accomplished he had been doing his extracurricular work alongside his actual work, and full marks. Again, it comes back to this business that we've been talking about quite a lot of him being multi-talented. And, he was obviously extremely talented at doing the main job, the aerial reconnaissance photography interpretation, and he was extremely accomplished at recording what was going on around him. So, yeah, and here's the proof of it, May 1945. But of course, by that time, he had been to, they crossed the Rhine, of course, and they'd been up through northeastern Germany, and they had come to Belsen.
Yeah.
And there's a long story here, which we are not going to be able to go into. But there was some doubt about whether Dirk himself had actually seen what went on at Belsen, or what had happened at Belsen. And the reasons for it were, one, that what on earth would he be doing there? Surely there was an exclusion zone around the place as soon as it was discovered that typhus was rife. Secondly, it was in no way part of his duties. Thirdly, and this was the most striking thing of all to me, given the restrictions on what people at war were able to write back to home, there is no indication whatsoever in his letters to his family, of which I've seen one or two, of him having come upon anything so ultimately horrific as what was on display at Belsen. So I was, two very authoritative people shared that skepticism, and indeed it sort of reinforced it. And I felt that maybe he was not the victim of, but the recipient of received memory or false memory syndrome, whatever one wants to call it these days. And that this vivid imagination of his had absorbed the newsreels, had absorbed the newspaper photographs. They had obviously been near two other concentration camps. Soltau was one, and there's another one, Rhine, I can't remember its name now, but very near Soltau Dachau, and they had definitely been very close to those. So I thought that it was perfectly reasonable for these skeptical authorities to say, well, we doubt that he actually went through the gates. But there was no doubt that he was extremely affected by what he had seen maybe elsewhere and by what he'd seen with the newsreels, etc. So in my book, I was dubious, I suppose is the right word. But then fortunately, Paul, out of the blue, a gentleman called Mark Selinschak got in touch with me, and he's an academic who's now working in America, but he's Canadian, and he'd been researching precisely what happened at Belsen. And he wrote a considerable book about it. And while he was putting the book together, he got in touch with me and said that he had reason to believe that Dirk had actually gone through the gates. And I now believe it too, because there's a piece of extraordinary evidence in the Imperial War Museum, a memoir, a recorded memoir by an Austrian emigre who was working, first of all, with the Pioneer Corps and then with the Intelligence Corps, who arrived at Belsen on the 20th of April. And while he was looking in horror around him, a jeep turns up with 3 British Army officers on board. And 2 of them are not particularly sympathetic or empathetic, but one of them was so struck that he was transfixed. And the Austrian emigre, whose name is Kodin, Andre Kodin, had this officer's face imprinted in his memory in an extraordinary way. So much so that 10 years later, he's sitting in a cinema in London, and he's watching a Bogarde film, and up on the screen comes Dirk Bogarde. And Mr. Kodin leaps to his feet and says, "It's him, it's him." He remembered Dirk from that visit to Belsen. And I find that there was then a little bit of correspondence between them much later on when Dirk wrote about the Holocaust for the Telegraph. And although Dirk was not fantastically committal about it, nonetheless, there was an acknowledgement there that he had seen what he had seen, quite rightly. And so my feelings have changed quite dramatically, actually. And I now really do believe that he went in there, stayed for no time at all, because the other 2 basically dragged him away. And anyway, what good could they be? That they'd witnessed, they'd seen this horror, and so off they went. And I have very mixed feelings about this, and I feel very sorry in a way that that there was a lot of doubt about it when it's such a hugely important matter. I mean, everything to do with the Holocaust, as we know, is so sensitive and so powerful, and will remain so for as long as people with any intelligence and sympathy.
Well, it is. The Holocaust is one of those aspects of World War II study where, as you say, this idea of being influenced by newsreels and imagery is so pronounced, because whatever age you are, when you first see whatever it is, whether you see a Pathé newsreel or you see Schindler's List or you visit one of those sites, those images imprint on your brain. So everything else you then read about it filters through that imagery there. And so it's very common for people to have mixed up images of that they add the chimneys they didn't see. I mean, it happened in the Sam Fuller show. Sam Fuller is quoted in documentaries in the 80s saying he saw death camps. I mean, he saw a satellite camp for a concentration camp. It's all part of the same horror.
Yeah.
But over the years, Sam, it seems, adds the chimneys, adds bits to it, and it becomes a mixture of his own memory and images that he has seen. And it's completely understandable with something as horrendous. And so inhuman as the Holocaust is our brains naturally, when we see something so horrific, do everything they can to repress it, block it away, push it aside. And because in your book you talk about the kind of the day or the day after Dirk, now you think he did go to Belsen, he's writing letters to his family about other things. And how could that visit there have not somehow affected how you wrote letters the next day. But I think it's how our brains work. After something as horrific as going through the gates of Belsen, your brain would do everything it could to get rid of that memory for a while, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, the 21st of April, he wrote to Elizabeth, his sister, again, hoping that she was having a gay time, as he put it, asking for news of her current beau, and said this: "We've been having the most beautiful weather here. I've actually been sunbathing and got quite brown."
Yeah.
That is extraordinary.
I mean, before you had this other evidence about the Jeep, that to me is a clear bit of evidence that he hadn't been anywhere near Belsen. If you're writing that letter that same week, but you know, this is interesting, and because he, in his own books, he skirts around the Holocaust over years. He doesn't devotes one big work to here's my experience of Holocaust. It was a little bit there, a little bit there. Of course, he made the night porter, things like that brings it up. An interviewer's asking a little bit, and you had to pull that story together through a little thread from there, a little bit from there. And but now, with the benefit of hindsight, with the understanding you have now that he was at Belsen, what it's a trite question to ask, but what influence do you think that had on how Dirk saw the war he'd been living up to that point and the rest of his life? Because it's, you know, the episode of Band of Brothers it's called Why We Fight. How many servicemen at the point of seeing that horror said that's why I enlisted, that's why I did what I did. It's that culmination of what you're fighting for. So do you think Dirk had that kind of reaction to it?
Well, there was something that he wrote in his final volume of memoirs, which was cleared for takeoff, which has quite an extended passage about this. And he says, "We followed the black and yellow signs to Bergen-Belsen, where we lost our boyish laughter forever." Well, that to me is a hugely powerful sentence. Yeah. It really is. And I think it answers your question, really.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, in terms of his war, he ends up finishing in Calcutta. I mean, it's the other theatre. as are often a lot of officers, the war's not over. He ends up out there, and then we'll move on and talk about his war films post-war. But just wind down how his war comes to an end.
Well, of course, it really finished in Europe, to be honest. He went off to Calcutta because they thought there was going to be a very serious invasion of Malaya, Operation Zipper. And whatever was due to happen didn't happen. And so, that's Java, that one. So that's the final stage of it all. But the picture you just showed was him at a fairground with 4 of his companions from the forces on a day off in Calcutta, where they just sort of hung around waiting for nothing to happen. You know, it never did. So there was no reconnaissance work to be done. It was all very free, easy, and casual. It was during this this posting, that he allegedly was involved in a fatal car accident. This was something that I could find no evidence of at all, but he gave it as his reason for never driving. There is a theory that his real reason for not wanting to drive in later years was that he loved being chauffeured, but that's another story. So anyway, this is a fairly boring time in Calcutta, and then he is asked to go to Java.
This is an interesting photo that you added, because you think that might be Dirk on the right there, but you're not sure.
It's just possible, but we don't know. We simply don't know. It could be him. Anyway, this is him, if it is him, to the right of Major General Douglas Hawthorne, who was the GOC. And that was a terrible place. Java was a real a tinderbox set to go up at any moment because of nationalism and because of trouble between the Dutch and the locals. And there was so much going on. Even the surrendered Japanese were involved in the difficulties that the British forces had to contend with. A lot of terrorism happening. It was a very unpleasant place. But Dirk was the ADC to Hawthorne. And he writes very amusingly about it all. And it was, there was nothing hugely important to do, but there was for some of the troops, but not for he himself. And so it all ended with a bit of a whimper rather than a bang. And he comes, I should say, actually, Paul, that the one thing that he did keep going big time while he was there was his writing, because he was editing, contributing to, and generally dominating the Forces paper, which was called The Fighting Cock. And there's a lot of his writing in the few copies of that remain. And it's great stuff. It really is. You can see where the second career was beginning to be formed. Back he comes. The draft of one is demobbed in September 46, and all over September 46.
But, you know, we've ended up spending an hour and a half talking about his war, which is amazing. I've enjoyed this thoroughly, John, but we should spend a little bit of time going through his war films. But I want to kind of do the introduction. Of course, he was always part of that star system. So he was under contract to do films. We're not talking about kind of the 60s and 70s. People like Burt Lancaster made the films they wanted to make. Dirk, by the time he finds stardom, it's contract work, isn't it? So his war films don't necessarily, until later, convey some of this experience he'd had. They're very much as good as he was in them, the formulaic kind of British boy's own output that was coming out in the 50s. I do wonder, when he found himself an actor and found himself making war films, did he relish these roles? Was it a job? Did he want to do more with them? For someone who's seen Belsen, for someone who's seen what he's seen, Appointment in London is a pretty good one, but I watched Ill Met by Moonlight last week just to prep for this, and I hadn't watched it for a long time, and I found the tone of it very odd. They Who Dare also is a strangely mixed tone film of adventure and also kind of comic book. So what do you think Dirk thought when he started getting these roles later in his career as a major star, as he was in the 50s?
Just jobs. Certainly at that stage, you know, this was possibly the best of all his films. The one you forgot the slide up of there, the Appointment in London, best of all the war films that he did. And on his right is his companion, Tony Forward. Which is on his left, our right. That's the best of them when he plays the wing commander who's flown 87 sorties. You know, he seems to have some sort of death wish about him. That's a good movie. They Who Dare, by the way, was dubbed How Dare They by one very offensive critic. And so that was a joke. And The Sea Shall Not Have Them, of course, that gave rise to the great line that Noel Coward is reputed to have uttered, which was, "I don't see why not everyone else has." And then Ill Met by Moonlight, a sort of caper based on Paddy Lee Firma's experiences on Crete. Wind Cannot Read.
That's my mum likes The Wind Cannot Read, but it's a bit vomit-inducing these days, if I'm being honest.
And that's Tony Forward again on the left. One of his very few roles in films.
But you know, and Password is kind of, it's interesting how he played these characters, because Charles Coward's real history has been brought into question in more recent years about some of the stuff he did, as indeed. I forgot, you just said his name, the guy in Ill Met by Moonlight, who's the real... Some of his escapades have been questioned in more recent years by serious historians. So it's an interesting portfolio of films, but I don't think it has that classic. Well, Kenneth More and Reach for the Sky is an enduring film. I don't think any of these films really will stand the test of time.
I don't think any of those, with the possible exception of Appointment in London. But you then get with this...
King and Country is a good film.
Now, you get something really serious going on, which goes right to the heart, I think, of what Dirk felt about war in general. His First World War film, of course, shot by Joseph Losey in just a few days at Shepperton. And that's Tom Courtenay, who is being court-martialed for having deserted. And it was the beginning of some sort of understanding in the popular currency of shell shock. You know, what exactly was this? Was it cowardice? Was it shell shock? It was, of course, it was shell shock. And Bogarde finds himself in the unhappy position of having to defend Courtney, and finally having to do the sort of ultimate act, which is an extraordinarily powerful picture. Really,
hugely popular in France, by the way. Interestingly, it's one of those ones that when I first got a copy of it on DVD, it was the French had released it long. It had been forgotten by the British audience, but it's still on French TV every now and then. I forget what they call it now. It's not for King and Country. They translate it. They give it a different title, but it for whatever reason, it resonated with the French, perhaps more so than the British audience, because it was 64. This is right in the middle of when we're doing the 633 Squadron, Heroes, Guns of Navarone, and it's just blow things up and have a good time era very much. There's not much depth coming out of British war cinema at this time, but King and Country is challenging. It's got similarity to Journey's End in some ways. The sensibility and the anti-war nature of it, and again a fine performance by Bogarde, and I guess he enjoyed that one more. And I guess by the 60s, is he getting a bit more say in what roles he takes?
Oh yes, he's just finished his second stint of contract with Rank. That was 1961, actually,
right.
And then he made Victim, a very important film in his career.
Of course,
So we're now 2 or 3 years on, but he's done The Servant in the meantime with Joe Lacey. And so you've just said something really, really interesting about how King and Country goes down so well in France. So does The Servant. And there's something about Joe Lacey, which I've always felt very strongly, which although, he was born in America, he has this sensibility of Europeanism. And gosh, we talked about this a long time ago, didn't we? Right back at the beginning of the conversation.
But interesting, because Dirk Bogarde, sorry to interrupt again, Dirk Bogarde doesn't come across in that English way. I think a particular, and Anthony Steele in that era could not be more English.
Yeah.
And Kenneth More, I guess, couldn't be more English. David Niven really couldn't be more English. There's something about Dirk that is a bit more European. It is a bit more, I can see a European audience identifying with Dirk Bogarde's performing in the way they couldn't with Anthony Steele, who is a very caricatured English actor. But Dirk Bogarde, very European. High Bright Sun is not a... Well, there's some nice ideas it tries to establish about that post-war period and the empire devolving and Cyprus, but it ends up becoming a really pretty poor action thriller.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, it'll be more interesting. We talked about that last night, and Nick said about Kenneth More that this was very much a movie Kenneth More took kind of because it was a job. What was Dirk's
it was a
interest in it?
Yeah, a favour to Richard Attenborough.
Right.
And, they'd been muckers for a long, long time. And, it all went a little bit haywire shortly afterwards with A Bridge Too Far, but that's, another story.
Well, I mean, the two we want to talk about are clearly going to be The Night Porter and A Bridge Too Far, because both controversial in very different ways. Yeah. With The Night Porter, that was a real bold move by any actor to do something that way about the Holocaust with love and all the themes that brings up. I mean, completely European by nature, but it was a big hit, wasn't it? At least in Europe. How did that role came about for him? And was it something he sought? I mean, he can do what he wants at this point. Having done Death in Venice by now, he's now been seen by all the European directors and the avant-garde, the art house people. So I guess he can pick and choose, but that role was an odd one. And given his experience of having seen Belsen, do you think there was any conflict about whether he should have taken that role on?
I think there possibly was an element of catharsis about it. I don't know. I don't know for sure. But, this was a really, really challenging piece of cinema. Liliana Cavani, the director, wanted him and got him, and also managed to acquire Charlotte Rampling. And, it's a very strange movie, considered by some to be Holocaust porn. Well, I don't believe it's that. Cavani is very, very firm in explaining that something like this really did happen, and she had a couple of witnesses of similar things occurring, where a concentration camp inmate has some sort of love affair with one of the officers guarding her or running the camp. There is apparently historical evidence, if not precedent, for this. But it was a hugely dangerous movie to make for all sorts of reasons. But Dirk, at this point, you're so right. He was up for a challenge. The more challenging the role, the more he grabbed at it. And that goes back to his Victim Day in 1961. That was the start of, when he felt he would do a certain amount of movies in order to keep the roof on the house. But what he really wanted to do to satisfy the longing in him to be a creative artist was to take on work that was on the edge, challenging, difficult. And look at another film that he was about to make, Providence, a bizarre picture. But it was challenging in a different way, intellectually challenging. This was more visceral, The Night Porter, and it left a sour taste with a lot of people. But I saw it again not so long ago. And there is a very strong piece of polemic going on there, which he should be congratulated on.
I think it's one of those films that you have to watch it in the old-fashioned way of one sitting. It doesn't work well in that modern way of seeing clips of it here and there, because out of context, there are sequences in it that stand alone are a bit weird. You can read this Holocaust porn thing. You have to watch the whole thing. Got to watch it, and that's it. Treat it that way. And it's interesting, by this era, the 70s, people like Alec Guinness, John Mills, David Niven particularly, they're just making any old film for the money now. David Niven, I can't think of anything particularly challenging he does in the 70s. John Mills did Ryan's Daughter, I suppose, was a bit changed, but he's just churning out, the cameo as the general, the cameo as the elder family man. He's not pushing himself. Dirk is really going for it and sometimes failing and sometimes having these huge successes. But we must bring up To Bridge Too Far, because everybody watching Bridge Too Far, whenever it comes up, as whenever Arnhem comes up on World War II TV, everyone's got an opinion about who's to blame, who's this. And this portrayal of Browning, it's interesting because I'll talk about General Urquhart first, because people's historical interpretation of General Urquhart as played by Sean Connery is entirely favorable because of Sean Connery's portrayal. When you're looking at Sean Connery shoot a German through the window of a house in Arnhem, you think, oh my God, Bond's just killed a German. What you should be thinking is, why has a general allowed himself to be cut off from his command? Why is he going on a solo escapade? But because it's Sean Connery, you somehow embrace him being a badass, as the Americans would say, behind the lines, killing Germans. And Bogarde's portrayal of Browning, conversely, has left us with a view of Browning that is, I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's a particular type of portrayal. When you look at Connery and Bogarde's performing in that film, it's left a real legacy of how those two generals are perceived. And he got into a bit of hot water, as you said. You just mentioned there. It affected his relationship with Richard Attenborough. Daphne du Maurier, Browning's widow, got involved in it. So run us through how he approached it and what the fallout was. And did you think he regretted making the film?
I think he did, because he became the subject of derision, and that was something that really he would never, ever tolerate. It's so fascinating, this, Paul. He had a script. Okay, the original script that I saw has Browning saying to Roy Urquhart, "We just tried to go a bridge too far." And then that was changed largely as a result of campaigning, I think, by Dirk and the pressure being put on Attenborough by Daphne du Maurier, Lady Browning, to well, as you know, I've always thought that we tried to go a bridge too far. Those are the words that resonate off the soundtrack. When the original line was what Browning actually said to Monty, I think we might be going a bridge too far. So if that had been portrayed faithfully, if that first, the actual line had been in the film, there would have been none of this fuss, I'm absolutely sure, because the whole thing would have been structured in a different way. What had happened was that, of course, the top tier, the Ikes and the Montes, had been stripped out of the action for the film, and so one was left with tier 2, and so it then became this dialogue, these difficulties between the commanding officers on the ground, and there was, what was happening at HQ. Ultimately was not being faithfully portrayed. So again, and also to satisfy the American audience and so on, all sorts of compromises were made. But the bottom line is that when the film was premiered, and incidentally, Patrick Gibbs in the Daily Telegraph said of Browning as portrayed by Dirk, this general is not one I would have trusted to run a cocktail party. Well, that's a fantastically unfair thing, but it was based upon what he had seen and heard in the movie. So there was a fantastic furor in the Times. And that was hugely affecting to Dirk, because, of course, the Times was his father's paper. So to be derided on the pages of the Great Thunderer was absolutely no way that Dirk could tolerate it.
It is unfortunate how he comes across. I mean, the whole sequence with the intelligence officer coming in with the photos, and the irony of him having been an intelligence officer himself in the war. There's so many weird levels to that whole scene there, but it just makes him sound arrogant and dismissive of it. And of course, when you look at the real history there was a whole division of people. This is an operation planned by lots of people. One general isn't giving it the go ahead. It's unfortunate, and it's a great film. I love the film, but the Dirk Bogarde is a victim of it in many ways.
Yes.
And Sean Connery comes out of it so well. And yet, actually, I think General Urquhart is not a great general. I don't think he did particularly well at Arnhem. And I think it's a shame that the world has divided it into Sean Connery, good guy, General Browning, idiot. It's the real General Browning was neither a hero or a villain. He's somewhere in between the two. And as all commanders of men are, they're fraught with all these different levels of expectation. There's lots of things. There's balls they're juggling, plates they're spinning. And you make decisions and things go wrong. And as you say, the fact they chose not to have Montgomery portrayed on screen or Eisenhower is Browning is seen to be the complete top of the pyramid, when in fact he's not the top of the pyramid. He's not even on as you say, the first level. He's the second level down. And it is interesting. What does his family feel about Bridge Too Far now? What do they? Is it a bit of a mixed bag for them?
I to be honest, I don't think it resonates all that strongly now. It's a hell of a long time ago, frighteningly long time ago. But when it turns up on the TV, and I'm with you, it stands up incredibly well. It's extraordinarily well shot and put together, but with this fundamental flaw to it, which we've been examining. No, I've to be honest, I don't think I've ever had a long conversation with any member of the family about how that film affected them. Although Dirk's nephew, with whom I'm in regular touch, what he'd seen Rock, and he and I have discussed the movie once or twice, and yes, and it is just incredibly unfortunate that a lovely relationship between Dirk and Attenborough, which went back right to the days just after the war when they first acted together in a film called Dancing with Crime. I mean, it's 1947. This was a huge friendship, and they were next door neighbors in France, which makes it even more complicated. But this thing should collapse because of script difficulties. It's just very sad, and there was no real patching up that went on afterwards. A little bit, but thanks to Lady Attenborough, things were a little bit smoothed over. But Dirk was resentful, big time. He wrote a horrible letter to Attenborough, apparently, which Attenborough tore up.
Wow.
It wasn't good. It wasn't good. But yes, and it's sad that the last of the films of Dirk in uniform should be remembered from his point of view in this way. It is a great sadness.
So to round things off, and you're talking about this great sadness, I mean, you said at the beginning of the show you wrote the book some years ago now, and you've got more information now, and we're now firmly in the internet era when things can be double checked, and people discovering Dirk's films now, people discovering his writing now. Just to sort of conclude things, how did he move on from the war, or was the war always some kind of demon in his life? I know he had other things going on, his sexuality, all that was, but the war, did it loom large, do you think, for the rest of his life, or was there a process where he was able to kind of put it to bed?
Well, that's really interesting. I think it would have been the case to a large extent had it not been for the fact that he did write about the Holocaust. And then he wrote twice for us about it on the Telegraph papers. And huge postbag came in after each piece. People congratulating him. They were very, very... they found what he had to say illuminating and resonant. And it's good that he should have found such a satisfactory way of perhaps exorcising the demons, exorcising rather than exercising. Exorcising demons, of which there were, of course, many. And it's the war. The war had a massive part to play in the development of Dirk's character, no question about it at all. And the way in which he was able to somehow put some coherence to it was impressive. 65 movies he made. 15 books. And I just have a feeling that what he would have loved to have had on his gravestone, if there was such a thing, he doesn't have a gravestone as such, it would have been Dirk Bogarde, writer and actor, because actually the writing was perhaps, in the end, more important than the acting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering whether his time in the army was, as we said earlier, in fact, the ability to learn how to function within an organization that you're actually slightly outside of, but you're also in, because he had to function within the acting world when he was concealing a certain part of himself. He had to kind of, I think maybe had he not had that war service, he wouldn't have found that structure of being able to kind of compartmentalize his life and say, okay, this is my public job, this is what I'm doing. And the army taught him how to fit in, I suppose.
Well, it's really interesting because he just found a quote here, which really resonated with me when he wrote to his dad on the 7th of May of 1945. And he said, "I think I'll have a serious try at staying on with the army. I've enjoyed the companionship and the unexpected lack of responsibility. The army, as far as it can, does take care of you, and I'm not at all certain now that I would ever be able to settle down among civilians again." And
wow.
That's a really deep, it's a profound piece.
Yeah, it is.
Writing,
and not
so
you kind of expect to come from him, really. But well, I think we need to bring this in because we've been at it for a lot. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed this, John. I've learned so much about Dirk and his war, and I think people watching this, even though it's a long show, will thoroughly enjoy the trying to peel the onion that is Dirk Bogarde and get through the layers. I guess you've not completely peeled through the onion yet, and I don't think anyone. I don't expect he himself really understood who he was completely. But as far as understanding his war and what the war did, and I'm glad we sort of settled as best we can the Belsen story, and that's important because there's lots of rubbish written on the internet about that. And well, anyway, anything else you want to say? A final remark?
Well, just on the Belsen thing, finally, is that I did write a piece about this, about my change of opinion, which is up on the dirkbogarde.co.uk website, and that's run by his nephew Brock. Very elaborate site it is too. It means a lot, and I think it probably would have meant a lot to him as well, to Dirk. He was an enigma, Paul. And
We
he
use that word too much, and I think we use the word Renaissance man. We throw that around to people who perhaps don't deserve it, but in his case, a Renaissance man and an enigma and a huge talent in many regards. And I hope that people will be studying his films like King and Country and Victim and some of the other Night Porter in years to come, because they are important films. They are important bridges between, I think, British cinema and European cinema. That's why I feel he kind of straddled both those areas, because European cinema can be sometimes a bit inaccessible to a Brit, and sometimes British cinema can be a bit inaccessible to Europeans. But he was able to bridge that very well. As I said, that's why the French seem to, well, he made it his second home. But they seem to embrace his cinema and give him a level of respect that perhaps Britain didn't quite do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And I think it all happened with The Servant. It gave him a tremendous reputation with the Europeans, and then with Death in Venice internationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
So interesting, the key stages. And of course, the very first one of them all was Doctor in the House with Kenny Moore.
With Ken Moore, yeah, which I haven't seen for ages. It seemed to be on television all the time. I haven't seen it for ages. I have to search it out again. It's probably, I hope it's as good as I remember it, because as a kid, that was one of those films that my grandma and granddad would watch. It was one of those family films. I hope it's as good. I'll have to find it and show it to my other half. But
well, that was the one that made Dirk the superstar of the box office. And
anyway,
didn't do too badly for Kenny Moore either.
No, indeed. Well, thank you very much, John. This has been absolutely a pleasure talking to you. It seems to have taken a long time to actually happen, this interview. I first started contacting weeks and months ago now, but I'm glad we've done it. And thank you very much for taking part. And I will put the link to your book in below.
Thank you for your amazing prep. Thank you.